Today, President Trump is heading to McAllen, Texas. This is a city right along the border with Mexico.
Right. It is one of dozens of towns on the nearly 2,000-mile stretch where the president hopes to build a wall or a barrier. The border wall is the reason the partial government shutdown is stretching into day 20. And it's why negotiations broke down again yesterday between the White House and congressional Democrats. Vice President Mike Pence blamed Democrats.
Today, in this brief meeting, we heard once again that Democratic leaders are unwilling to even negotiate.
Meanwhile, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said it's the president who won't budge, and the president who ended the meeting yesterday rather abruptly.
Well, unfortunately, the president just got up and walked out.
Okay, well, let's bring in NPR White House correspondent Scott Horsley to talk about this moment. Good morning, Scott.
Good morning, David.
Okay, so no one is budging. This partial government shutdown, if it's not resolved by tomorrow, and there's no sign it will be, you're going to have hundreds of thousands of government workers missing their first paycheck. Are you seeing any sides of the Democrats or Republicans cracking here?
Not at the top, David. Democrats, led by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, are not about to reward the president for shutting down parts of the government. They feel like that would just encourage him to resort to extortion whenever he doesn't get what he wants. And the president is reluctant to end the border shutdown without a wall because he feels like this is his really only point of leverage. There have been some small cracks among rank-and-file Senate Republicans, especially a few who are up for re-election in 2 years, who have said they would like to see the shutdown ended while negotiations continue. But that only matters if the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is willing to go along, and so far he's not.
And Senate Republicans are critical, right? Because, the House, led by Democrats now, last night passed a bill to reopen to the government, but probably not going to go anywhere if you don't have leadership in the Senate actually saying, maybe we'll think about this.
Nowhere except as a talking point and a way for Democrats to underscore their message that this shutdown is the responsibility of the president. Polls already suggest that most Americans blame President Trump for this shutdown. Not surprising, since he's been pretty transparent about using it as a bargaining chip. And as you say, tomorrow is when this becomes very real in a financial way for those 800,000 federal workers who are supposed to get a paycheck and will miss one for the first time since it's all began back before Christmas.
Okay, so President Trump, he walks out of a meeting with congressional leaders yesterday. That's the scene in Washington. Now he's shifting the backdrop. He's going to the border. Beyond a scene change, what is the president hoping to accomplish here?
This is sort of the field trip version of the speech he gave from the Oval Office on Tuesday night. It's an opportunity for him to try to paint this border situation as both a humanitarian and a national security crisis. He's going to visit a Border Patrol station. He's going to visit the Rio Grande River itself. But, the mayor of McAllen has been holding his own photo ops and media interviews. On the one hand, he welcomes the president's visit. He welcomes some extra federal resources. But he's not thrilled about having his city, which he thinks is one of the safest in America, portrayed as some kind of desolate border badland of crime and drugs. So that's going to kind of undercut the president's message a little bit.
All right. Scott Horsley, NPR's White House correspondent. Scott, thanks.
Great to be with you, David.
We're going to turn now to Cairo, where Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is getting ready to give a big speech today.
Right. It was a decade ago that President Barack Obama went to Cairo to deliver a speech about his administration's foreign policy. Today, Mike Pompeo will give the Trump administration's version and perhaps some clarity after weeks of shifting positions on Syria and other regional issues.
And NPR's Michelle Kellerman has been traveling with the Secretary of State and joins us now from Cairo. And Michelle, you've been traveling a lot, right? Give us a sense of the ground Pompeo's covered.
Well, we're only just begun on this. We started in Jordan, a country that borders Syria, and one of the many in this region that's nervous about the U.S. troop withdrawal from Syria. Pompeo then took a day trip to Iraq, both Baghdad and up to Erbil in the mainly Kurdish north of the country. And his message has been basically this, that the U.S. troop pullout is a tactical shift, not a change in the U.S. goals in the region. He says the U.S. is committed to defeating ISIS and pushing back on Iran. And he's trying to downplay all these mixed messages coming from the administration on the conditions and the pace of that Syria troop pullout and what it'll mean to Kurdish fighters who help the U.S. in the fight against ISIS.
Okay, so now you're in Cairo, and it sounds like there are lots of people there with you covering this visit. I mean, what exactly is going to happen there?
Yeah, we're busy here at the Foreign Ministry building. He's already met with the country's president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who's been a big supporter of President Trump. Sisi has come under a lot of criticism from human rights groups for jailing thousands of activists. And while the State Department has raised some human rights concerns, it's also praising Sisi for his efforts to support Christians in Iraq. And that's something that Pompeo clearly appreciates. He's really put a priority on promoting religious freedom.
And Michelle, this really is a moment to sort of take stock of U.S. policy in this region, right? Because as Rachel said, I mean, it was a decade ago when President Obama gave this big speech there laying out his vision. I suppose this is really a chance for the Trump administration to use the same setting to lay out a vision that sounds like might be very different.
Yeah, well, you know, when Obama gave that speech in 2009, he was calling for a new beginning for U.S. relations with the Muslim world. He spoke at a very old university here. Pompeo is speaking at a different university, the American University of Cairo, and his message is likely to be far different. He's complained a lot that, especially about Obama's approach to Iran, focusing on the nuclear deal, and as Pompeo says, ignoring all the rest of Iran's bad behavior in the region. The Trump administration has been trying to keep focused on that, on Iran, and putting pressure on Iran.
And then after the speech, where do you all go from Egypt?
Oh, we have a big trip ahead. It's still Bahrain, UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman. Again, building up this coalition on against Iran. He'll have to deal with the Saudi-Qatar split, which is ongoing, a diplomatic dispute that they've had, and his envoy on that quit this week.
All right. Well, safe travels.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Michelle Kellerman, who is traveling with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in Egypt this morning. All right, about 10 to 20% of known pregnancies end in a miscarriage. That is as many as 1 in 5.
So a miscarriage is obviously an incredibly emotional experience. It's also a physically painful experience. And a woman often requires additional medical treatment to help her body clear the pregnancy. There is a new treatment that can make that process easier, but getting access to it is not so easy. It involves a combination of drugs, one that's been used for miscarriages, and the other is known as the abortion pill. And regulations around abortions in the U.S. can make that second pill difficult or even impossible for some women to get.
And we're joined in our studio this morning by Sarah McCammon, NPR correspondent. She's been reporting on this story, and she's been speaking to women in Canada where the drugs are more available, and also in the United States where they are less available. Sarah, thanks for being here.
Sure thing.
So start with telling us how this treatment works exactly.
Well, it is important to understand that sometimes a miscarriage happens on its own, completes naturally, but not always. Sometimes to expel the fetal remains, a woman needs surgery. Sometimes she needs drugs to finish the process. And there are a couple of different drugs involved here. As we said, doctors say the most effective protocol, they believe now, involves a drug called mifepristone, also known as the abortion pill. So this is a little complicated. Stay with me. I'm going to explain the difference of these two drugs. There are actually two in the protocol. The first is called misoprostol, which has been used in abortions, but also for accelerating miscarriages for years. What's newer is using mifepristone with it. It was approved by the FDA in 2000 for use in medication abortions, but there's growing evidence that it's helpful for miscarriages too. A recent article in the New England Journal of Medicine found that that combination of the drugs was faster and more effective than the old way, which was just misoprostol alone.
Okay, so mifepristone, this is the drug that is harder for women in the United States to access. Explain
Exactly.
why that's the case.
Well, since it was approved for abortions, it's been heavily regulated. And unlike in Canada, where one woman I spoke to lives, it can't be stocked in pharmacies here in the U.S., and clinics that carry it have to apply for a special designation from the federal government. So some American doctors have said they've had trouble prescribing mifepristone for patients experiencing a miscarriage. Here's Kristen Brandy. She's an OBGYN at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School, and she's had some difficulty prescribing this drug.
And it's been really frustrating to know that there's a medication out there that I can give to my patients that I don't physically have to give to them.
I also talked to a woman in Canada. Her name was Kirsten Herbst, and she said, she'd recently gone through a miscarriage, and the chance to take the pills and go through this process that was very difficult for her in the privacy of her own home was really invaluable.
Okay, so Sarah, where is the opposition to this coming from?
Well, there's long been political debate around mifepristone in particular. Some anti-abortion groups say they have no problem using it just for miscarriage, but some have expressed safety concerns. One doctor I talked to who opposes abortion rights says she's mostly worried about safety, but she also worries that if regulations on mifepristone were relaxed, there would be more abortions. It's worth noting that multiple medical groups, including the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, or ACOG, are recommending this protocol and say it's safe and effective.
Well, if that's the case, I mean, is there movement to make this drug easier to get here in the U.S.?
Well, there's at least one lawsuit not directly linked to miscarriage, but it's about easing restrictions about using the drug in general for abortion. And several medical groups, including ACOG and the American Medical Association, are asking the FDA to relax the regulations for use in miscarriage. The FDA has told NPR it believes the restrictions are necessary for patient safety.
Okay, that's NPR correspondent Sarah McCammon, who's in our studios in Washington this morning. Sarah, thanks.
Thank you.
It's supposed to be payday for some 800,000 federal workers, but the partial government shutdown means that is not going to happen today.
Yeah, Lisa Honan is one of those federal workers, and that missing paycheck for her means that she has to find other ways to pay her bills.
We're going to probably withdraw on our 529 account for, I hate to say it, it's our funds for college that you put away for your kids.
Could be a lot of tough choices for federal workers like that. It has now been 21 days since this shutdown began, which means it's tied for the longest shutdown in history. And with budget negotiations stalled on funding a border wall, President Trump looks like he may be getting closer to declaring a national emergency to pay for the wall. That means he could sidestep Congress and they could pass a budget without funding the wall. So what is next if the president goes ahead and does that?
NPR's congressional correspondent Susan Davis is in the studio this morning. Good morning, Susan.
Good morning, Rachel.
Where are we at right now?
The stalemate continues. There has been no progress. They are no closer to a deal. And some lawmakers that have been trying to get a deal, people like Lindsey Graham, a Republican from South Carolina, have essentially said he does not see a pathway for a deal and that the only way out is for President Trump to use presidential emergency powers, declare a state of emergency on the border, and redirect funds on his own to build the wall.
Can he legally do that? I mean, is that within the president's authorities to do?
It's unclear. What is clear is that Democrats in Congress would likely challenge him in the courts and question the constitutionality of that. These emergency powers certainly give the president very broad leeway to make decisions, although I believe that Democrats would argue these powers were intended for things like after 9/11 or after Hurricane Katrina, states of emergency in which there is no doubt and no dispute of what the emergency is. There is obviously a big dispute on what the emergency is. However, if he were to do that, it could also give a pathway to reopen the government.
I mean, what does it say about where we're at as a country when the only way to get out of a government shutdown is to declare a national state of emergency?
You know, the congressional budget process has been broken for some time. I think we've seen fits and starts of these shutdowns, but it's a snowballing of effect of a government that's just simply not working very well.
Even if this happens, if the president does choose to use this card, declaring a national emergency, when would it actually go into place? Do you know about timeline?
It's unclear, but one thing that is important to remember when we talk about the wall, too, and this $5.7 billion, even if the president gets the money or directs it to the wall, it doesn't happen very fast. The money that was sent to DHS last year for last year's spending bills is still going out the door to fund border wall and structures along the border. Mm-hmm. So this new influx of cash doesn't happen fast and it doesn't happen quick. Contracts still have to go out. It takes a very long time to get these structures. So it could still be a very long process.
Before I let you go, I want to shift gears to some other congressional news. Michael Cohen, President Trump's former lawyer, who has pleaded guilty to campaign finance violations and other federal crimes. Cohen announced yesterday that he's going to go to Capitol Hill and testify before Congress. Who made this request?
The House Oversight Committee is led by Elijah Cummings. He's a Democrat from Maryland. They announced yesterday he would testify on February 7th. Cohen is expected to be the first of what could be many high-profile hearings on Capitol Hill this year, as House Democrats in their new majority intend to have fairly aggressive oversight and investigations into questions of how this administration has conducted itself. And it's important to note that Cohen is coming out voluntarily, but that also Democrats have said they are willing to use their subpoena power to to force as many people as possible to have pretty high-profile hearings that will be televised.
So even though Cohen has given extensive interviews to Robert Mueller and his team, Congress, Elijah Cummings, just want him on the record in a public venue.
Exactly.
NPR's Susan Davis for us this morning. Thanks, Sue. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is headed to the Gulf as he continues his grand Middle East tour.
Yeah, this comes after he stopped in Cairo yesterday, and that's where he outlined the Trump administration's vision for America's role in the Middle East. And in giving that speech, he took some direct hits at President Obama and his overtures to the Muslim world in his own speech that also took place in Cairo a decade ago.
The results of these misjudgments have been dire.
Here to tell us more about the impact of Pompeo's speech is NPR's Jackie Northam. Good morning, Jackie.
Good morning, Rachel.
What's the fallout been from this speech by Secretary of State Pompeo?
Well, a number of Obama supporters came out and said that essentially it was distasteful and that it was wrong to be criticizing a former president while on a high-profile trip like this. One of a former official within the Obama administration said he felt that Pompeo was living in a parallel world. It was an attack, really, on the Obama administration. Pompeo doesn't actually ever say his name, right, but there was no question he was talking about President Obama, and he criticized Obama for the nuclear deal with Iran and accused him of blaming the U.S. for the problems of the Middle East right now, when instead he should have been providing strong American leadership. And Pompeo said, and I'm quoting here, "The U.S. is a force for good in the Middle East." But, Rachel, one of the main reasons for this trip is to clear up confusion caused by conflicting statements within the Trump administration about the U.S. withdrawing troops from Syria.
Right, but Pompeo also said in that same speech, when the U.S., and I'm paraphrasing here, when the U.S. withdraws from the world, chaos ensues. So it's hard to make sense of that with the confusion over the Syria troop withdrawal.
Sure, and that's a harsh rhetoric, coming from a Secretary of State about a former president's administration.
So now, Secretary Pompeo, I understand he's already arrived in Bahrain, and then he's going to Saudi Arabia this weekend, right?
He is indeed, and he's expected to meet with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, just one of the many meetings he's got.
And, of course, we know that name because he's been implicated by U.S. intelligence agencies in the killing of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. Any idea as to whether or not Secretary Pompeo, is going to bring that up?
Yeah, no, that's definitely one of the things. I mean, this issue is not going away, the whole killing of Jamal Khashoggi. Now, this is the second time he's meeting with the Crown Prince. The first time he went a couple weeks after the killing of Khashoggi. There was pictures of the two men shaking hands and smiling broadly in that. And Pompeo said the Crown Prince categorically denied any involvement in Khashoggi's death. But since then, Rachel, the U.S. intelligence has assessed that the Crown Prince was involved.
So the Trump administration continues to take the Crown Prince's word over the word of its own intelligence agencies.
Right. President Trump says the Crown Prince denies involvement and that the U.S. has strong ties, particularly financial ties, to the kingdom. So, there's doubts that Pompeo will push the Crown Prince hard for any answers.
NPR's Jackie Northam for us this morning. Jackie, thanks. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rachel.
It has been a week of dramatic testimony in the trial of the notorious drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman.
Yeah, Guzman's already convicted of trafficking crimes in Mexico. His current trial, taking place in a Brooklyn federal court, centers on a 17-count indictment. The charges span decades. They include accusations of money laundering, also shipping tons of cocaine and other drugs into the U.S., also ordering hundreds of murders, kidnappings, and other acts of violence. And this week, really interesting stuff. We've gotten more insight into how the FBI ended up tracking his movements in real time.
Keegan Hamilton has been tracking all this. He's U.S. editor for Vice News and the host of a podcast called Chapo, Kingpin on Trial. He joins us now. Hey, Keegan, thanks for being here.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about what you saw unfold in the courtroom this week, and in particular, this key witness who worked for El Chapo. What can you tell us about him?
The star witness this week was named Christian Rodriguez. He is a Colombian systems engineer who was hired by the cartel to devise a secure communication system, which was sort of encrypted phone calls that he set up for the cartel in the mountains of Sinaloa, where Chapo was hiding out.
What did he say?
He said that he was approached by the FBI and recruited to become sort of an undercover informant who was giving them access to the cartel's communications in real time. That gave U.S. authorities sort of a live window into how Chapo was running his organization.
Huh. I mean, in our newsroom, we've just been kind of speculating about how dangerous it must be for people like him to come forward.
That was pretty incredible, and some of the testimony this week highlighted, how keenly aware he was of that. He had not one but two nervous breakdowns during his time working as an informant, had to seek mental health treatment for that, and the defense tried to use that against him, saying that some of the treatments he used affected his memory and recollection of the events.
So El Chapo has pleaded not guilty. How's he been reacting to all this testimony in court?
Normally he's actually kind of cheerful in the courtroom, looking over at his wife who's in the audience. In this case, the gravity of the testimony, it was very clear that this was another nail in his coffin, perhaps the final nail in his coffin. And he just sort of sat there looking stoically, almost grimacing, saying like, "Oh, this is it. I don't know if I can come back from this."
Huh. So obviously El Chapo is responsible for a lot of the drug trade here in the U.S. Is this trial teaching us anything about how the U.S. government deals with the quote-unquote war on drugs?
I think if anything, it's showing us the futility of the war on drugs. I mean, we've heard over and over again that Chapo is the one supplying these drugs, but while he's doing this, they're arresting his operatives, seizing tons of drugs. It's made no dent. He's been gone. Drugs are still available in the United States.
Where's the trial go now? I mean, how long is this expected to last?
We're hoping that this could wrap up potentially as soon as the end of this month, likely in early February.
All right, Keegan Hamilton of Vice. He's also the host of the podcast Chapo, Kingpin on Trial. We appreciate you sharing your insights into this trial. We appreciate it. Thanks, Keegan.
My pleasure.
So there is new reporting suggesting that the FBI was concerned about President Trump's possible ties to Russia going back to early 2016.
This latest revelation was first reported by the New York Times, and it showed that the FBI was on alert well before the Russian probe that began in 2017. In response to this reporting, Fox News host Gene Pirro asked the president over the weekend whether he has ever worked for Russia.
I think it's the most insulting thing I've ever been asked. I think it's the most insulting article I've ever had written.
Okay, let's sort through all this with NPR White House reporter Aisha Roscoe, who joins us this morning. Hi, Aisha.
Good morning.
Okay, so we're talking about two pretty major stories here on the FBI's inquiries into President Trump. Walk us through exactly what they're saying.
The New York Times revealed that the FBI's investigations had two parts. So one part we knew about, and that was the criminal investigation into whether Trump was obstructing justice when he fired former FBI Director James Comey.
Mm-hmm.
The other part, which hadn't been reported before, was the counterintelligence probe into whether Trump was acting on behalf of Russia after firing Comey, making it a national security issue. Then you had the Washington Post. Their story basically said that President Trump had actively worked to conceal details about his meetings with Russian President, with Putin. And so that idea, or Russian President Vladimir Putin,
right,
and that there were no in-depth records of any of Trump's in-person meetings with Putin's, not even classified records. And Trump and the White House have pushed back against these stories, but not really with detailed, specific denials. And Trump told Fox News in an interview that he wasn't keeping anything under wraps.
I mean, this is all extraordinary. I mean, we should say, as you said, the White House is pushing back, and President Trump has called all of this a hoax. But just the suggestion that the intelligence agencies are worried that the president of the United States is working with or for another government and hiding what happens in meetings with another foreign leader, that this has to be bringing significant reaction.
It is. And you have Democrats who control the House are saying they are going to investigate. The House Foreign Affairs Committee is saying they're going to look into Trump's interactions with Putin. And Adam Schiff, the Democratic chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, he tweeted that Democrats had tried to subpoena the interpreter who was at one of the meetings with Trump and Putin during the last Congress, but Republicans blocked that. Now, that may be on the table again, and there'll be some disputes over that. But either way, these types of these types of articles being written and reported about Trump and Russia are going to spur more probes by the House.
You bring up that interpreter. I mean, that interpreter might be the only person who, besides Putin and Trump, who might know exactly what happened in those meetings.
Yes, exactly. And so that's why there's an interest there.
Okay, so this is all happening as we mark this day as the partial government shutdown entering its fourth work week now. Any end in sight?
Not really. There wasn't any movement over the weekend. You do have some lawmakers who seem to be getting a bit antsy about getting the government back open. Here's South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham on Fox News Sunday.
Before he pulls the plug on the legislative option, and I think we're almost there, I would urge him to open up the government for a short period of time, like 3 weeks, before he pulls the plug, see if we can get a deal.
And so there, Graham is talking about after 3 weeks, if they can't get a deal, declaring a national emergency so Trump could build the wall without Congress's approval. And then you have some Democrats who are saying that centrist Republicans in the Senate should put pressure on McConnell and put pressure on the president to go ahead and open up the government again. And that it's up to them to kind of force this issue. But none of these options so far are really gaining any traction or look close to becoming reality. Right now, things just seem really stuck.
All right. Still stuck entering that fourth work week of the partial government shutdown. NPR's Aisha Roscoe. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, so British Prime Minister Theresa May is making one last push for her Brexit plan.
Right, so she is expected to deliver a speech to sell her plan today. And I know what you're thinking. Haven't I heard this like a million times before?
That's what I'm thinking.
Maybe not a million. But for sure, Theresa May has made speeches to try to sell the British Parliament on her Brexit plan. What is different now is that she is warning that if Parliament rejects her deal, Brexit might not happen at all. So the Parliament is going to vote tomorrow. This is being hailed as one of the biggest votes in decades.
And NPR's Frank Langfitt is in London. Frank, is this just a broken record, or is this moment really different somehow?
Well, this is actually pretty interesting. What she's going to do is Prime Minister's going to go to speak to factory workers in a place, English city called Stoke-on-Trent, which voted heavily to leave the EU in 2016. And what she's basically going to say is if Parliament doesn't back her deal, which sets out the terms for how the UK would leave the EU at the end of March, that members of Parliament are likely to torpedo the whole Brexit process. And she's going to say, really defy the democratic decision of the British people back in 2016. Also expected to say that trust in politics will suffer, quote, catastrophic harm if the referendum result is foiled.
So after all this, all the machinations, all the political debate, all the concerns, I mean, she is about to say that Brexit might not happen at all?
Yeah, she is going to say that, because I think that her concern is that if she's very concerned about losing control of this process if her bill goes down, her withdrawal agreement goes down to a big defeat tomorrow night, and that members of Parliament may push for a second referendum. And that's something that even 6 weeks ago didn't seem realistic, but now it's a genuine possibility.
So as we talk about her raising the stakes, what is the Prime Minister trying to do here? What strategy is at play, do you think?
Well, I think what you're seeing is she is very concerned of losing this and not having it be able to go anywhere. And what she's basically going to do is say, the future of democracy is at stake. And so if you don't go with this, this is going to really fall apart. And really, basically, what she's going to say to her Brexiteer colleagues in the Conservative Party is, if you don't back me, you're going to lose what you care about most. And one of the reasons she's doing this is she's really struggled through this whole process, as we've been talking about now for many, many months. And I think this is a sign that she doesn't have many cards left to play. And this is the one that she's decided to play this morning.
And what happens in her strategy going forward? I mean, it sounds like these could be some dramatic days.
Yeah, I think we'll have to see tomorrow night how big the vote is, how much of a loss she faces. Most people think she's going to face a loss. And then she's going to be given 3 days to come up with a plan B. Now, keep in mind, they've been doing these negotiations for over a year and a half. So it's just 3 days to do that. She's expected to probably go back to Brussels, try to get some concessions on this very unpopular withdrawal agreement that most members of Parliament seem to be very much against. The opposition Labour Party, they smell blood. They say they will call for a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister's government, but they haven't said exactly when. Their strategy is to try to basically win a no-confidence vote, trigger a general election, and try to topple the prime minister and her Conservative Party. Parliament, as I mentioned earlier, David, could move to take control of this process, which up until now the government's been driving. And that could mean trying to come up with a new deal with the EU, which there doesn't seem to be at all the time for that, which is a possibility of trying to delay Brexit. Then there's the big possibility, as May's talking about now, the possibility of a second referendum with an option to stay inside the EU.
Which would be extraordinary. All right, NPR's Frank Langfitt in London. Thanks a lot, Frank.
Happy to do it, David.
All right, public school teachers in Los Angeles are expected to go on strike beginning this morning.
Yeah, this is going to impact nearly 500,000 public school students. This is the country's second largest school district, so a lot of kids will be affected. Los Angeles teachers have been working without a contract for more than a year. They've been grappling with the school district over salaries and classroom conditions.
And one person covering this is Kyle Stokes from member station KPCC in Los Angeles. He joins us now from our studio at NPR West. Good morning, Kyle.
Morning, David.
All right, so negotiations, we're talking about talks that go back to early 2017. Just remind us, what are teachers demanding and why has there been no breakthrough at all?
Well, there's not been a lot of a breakthrough because there's a really fundamental issue at stake here, and that's how much money the LA Unified School District even has to spend on the demands its teachers are making. The two sides can't even agree on that. So right now, the school district has nearly $2 billion in the bank, and the president of the teachers union, United Teachers Los Angeles, his name is Alex Caputo Pearl, says it's time to start spending that money.
To be hoarding $2 billion in a school district that is more low income and more of color than just about any in the nation is a practice that must be challenged based on racial justice grounds.
I mean, Kyle, that's an extraordinary accusation to say that the school district is hoarding money and not spending on it, spending that money to help students. What is the administration's reaction to that?
Well, the school superintendent, Austin Buettner, who leads the school district, does plan to spend some of that reserve on things like teacher raises and other demands. But he also says the district just cannot afford to spend much more.
The notion that we are hoarding reserves, the notion that more money exists somewhere else with which to do more, is not accurate. We're spending all we have in service of our students.
Now, the teachers union just does not buy this. The district has been making dire projections about its finances for years, all while building up this nearly $2 billion reserve. And, between things like declining enrollment and things like rising pension costs, the district is still spending more money than it is taking in. And that has regulators concerned about the district's long-term solvency. So, long way of saying that is the root cause of this dispute. If you can't decide how much money there is to spend, it's really hard to figure out what kinds of demands are reasonable.
I mean, one question that always comes up in a teacher's strike is how much of this is about, teachers wanting more money to help students, and is some of it about getting more money for teachers, higher salaries?
Well, actually, the biggest sticking point here has actually been a plan to reduce class sizes. Now, that's a financial issue because having fewer students in classes means the need to pay more teachers. In negotiations, the district has pledged to spend about $130 million to reduce class sizes by a handful of students in certain grades. But that's not the only thing the union is asking for. For years, raising class sizes in LA has been used as an escape valve the district has used to solve its budget problems. There's language in the contract that lets the district do this. The union wants that escape valve closed off for good. That's been a fundamental sticking point.
KPCC's Kyle Stokes. Thanks, Kyle.
You're welcome.
Punishment in Congress has been a long time coming for Republican Steve King.
Yeah, long before his latest troubles, the Iowa congressman had a history of remarks about immigrants and about people of color. He referred to people from Mexico as, quote, dirt. He endorsed a political candidate linked with neo-Nazis, saying she supports, quote, Western civilization and, quote, our values. He narrowly won re-election last fall amid questions about his views of Jews and others. Now, House Republicans have stripped him of his committee assignments after he questioned why white supremacy is offensive. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy announced this move following a meeting of the Republican Steering Committee.
It was a unanimous decision from steering in light of the comments.
Iowa Public Radio's Clay Masters has followed King's career for years and is on the line. Hi there, Clay.
Good morning, Steve.
I got a question here of fact. Critics of this move have essentially said, okay, so Republicans are acting, but why would they even bother? Because they look the other way to so many remarks in the past. If you follow Steve King for years, as you have, his career for years, is it true that he talks this way all the time?
He does. Covering Congressman King over the years, he has a history of saying offensive things. I mean, I have a running list of them. We could go over them. It'd take up quite a bit of time. But top Republicans in the state, time after time again, from the governor to the party chair and the U.S. senators, Chuck Grassley and Joni Ernst, then regularly call out these remarks and say it does not represent their values, but that's kind of where it stops. And now it's a new Congress, and it's getting much more mainstream attention, I think largely because these comments were published in the New York Times. New Utah Republican Senator Mitt Romney, the one-time Republican presidential candidate, even called on King to step down.
He ought to resign and move on and let someone else who represents American values take his seat.
And a big one, Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post saying silence on this kind of rhetoric damages the party, and Scott's seen as a rising star in the GOP by many.
And we should just mention Tim Scott is African-American, one of relatively few top officials on the Republican side who are African-American, so his words carry a bit of extra weight in a situation like this. Now, we mentioned that King is being stripped of his committee assignments. What does that mean exactly?
Well, Congressman King was on the Agriculture Committee and the Judiciary Committees. I'm sure you're aware agriculture is a big industry in Iowa, and especially in the district he represents. The Judiciary Committee, which has jurisdiction over immigration, voting rights, impeachment, these kinds of things, and the Small Business Committee. And then again, this was a unanimous decision from the steering committee, as you mentioned.
Didn't Steve King take to the floor of the House the other day and say, wait a minute, my remarks, he didn't say he was misquoted quite precisely, but he suggested there was something wrong about, he made the mistake of talking to the media and that he was misunderstood in some fashion.
Yeah, he says the quote was mischaracterized in the New York Times, and reports have shown him walking out of the meeting with Representative McCarthy in silence. I'm in Des Moines, not in D.C., so I saw it on Twitter and not in person, but he walked to the elevator while news media followed him asking questions, and he really didn't say a word. Again, he says the quote was mischaracterized, and he also says he will, in the statement that he released yesterday, he will continue to point out the truth and work with all the vigor that he has to represent the district for at least the next 2 years.
Although when we say point out the truth, we should underline remark after remark after remark over years from Steve King suggests his basic beliefs are that Western civilization is threatened by immigration, that it has something to do with birth rates, that people from different countries can't uphold it. These are things he said again and again and again, right?
That's right.
Clay, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Steve.
That's Clay Masters of Iowa Public Radio. William Barr faces questions before the Senate today. His hearing for the post of Attorney General underlines the complexities of the job he is seeking because, in effect, he would have multiple masters.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it, because under the Constitution, he is appointed by the president, but he has to be confirmed by the Senate. He's answerable to Congress. And above all, he is supposed to enforce the law in this job. Now, senators want to know how Barr will handle these conflicting forces. If he's confirmed, he would oversee the special counsel's investigation of Russian involvement in U.S. politics, an investigation that is increasingly involving his boss. Now, we should say Barr was Attorney General once before, but that was a much less troubled time.
NPR Justice correspondent Ryan Lucas is covering his effort to become Attorney General once again. He's in our studios. Ryan, good morning.
Good morning.
What do we need to know about the background of William Barr?
Well, he is very much an establishment Republican lawyer. As you said, he served as Attorney General once before. That was from 1991 to 1993. So he would bring experience to the job. He also held other senior positions at the Justice Department, including the head of the Office of Legal Counsel, as well as Deputy Attorney General. So he knows the institution, and people who work there with him say that he does care deeply about the Justice Department. He would be taking over from Acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker, who stepped in on a temporary basis after then Attorney General Jeff Sessions stepped down under a lot of pressure from the White House.
That resume would make him sound like a non-controversial choice at a controversial moment, except for some remarks that he has made about the special counsel's investigation. What has he said?
Well, this is really going to be the focus of these confirmation hearings for Democrats in their questions for Barr. And what he's said that has really grabbed Democrats' attention is there's an unsolicited memo that Barr wrote basically last year to the Justice Department. And in that memo, he essentially says that Mueller would be wrong to pursue an obstruction of justice case against Trump, tied to Trump's firing of then FBI Director James Comey. Now, we learned last night from a letter that Barr sent to the committee chairman that Barr shared that memo or discussed it with several people, including many of President Trump's lawyers, as well as the man who is now White House counsel. Now, Barr was a private citizen at the time that he wrote the memo. He says the memo was based solely on information that was in the media, that he wrote it on his own. Still, for many Democrats, some have said that they want Barr to recuse himself from overseeing the Mueller investigation. They've called it a minimum for him to commit to allow it to proceed unimpeded. And they want him to promise to release to Congress and the American public the final report that Mueller's expected to
Okay,
write.
that's a list. Recuse yourself, stay out of the investigation, and release this public report, or make sure the report becomes public. Does he like to do those things?
Some of them, perhaps, but he's very unlikely to recuse himself. That's something that Sessions came under a lot of pressure from the president for doing. In a copy of Barr's written testimony that was released yesterday, Barr stops well short of recusing himself. He does say, though, that it's vitally important that Mueller be allowed to finish this investigation. He says the country needs answers. He vowed to be independent, not to interfere in Mueller's probe. And he said the public and Congress need to be informed of Mueller's results. He said his goal is to be as transparent as he can, consistent with the law. That, of course, fell far short of what Democrats wanted to hear.
Can Democrats stop him if they choose to?
The math is very much on the side of the GOP. They do have the numbers to get him confirmed, and GOP support at this point has been quite solid.
NPR's Ryan Lucas will be listening for your reporting as the confirmation hearings go forward. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, the big vote on Brexit is supposed to take place finally in Parliament today.
Yeah, and it is not looking good at all for Prime Minister Theresa May. The unpopular deal on the table is expected to fail in a Parliament vote. In a last push to sell her plan, May warned of dire consequences if this doesn't pass.
Fail, and we face the risk of leaving without a deal, or the even bigger risk of not leaving at all.
NPR's Frank Langfitt is covering this drama from London. Hi there, Frank.
Hey, Steve.
Okay, when last you discussed this vote with us some weeks ago, it was put off because losing would be such a total disaster for Theresa May. Did she make any progress in the last hours toward avoiding defeat this time?
I don't think people think so. You know, Parliament's had a long time to think this through. And it looks like there's a lot of opposition. We just don't know exactly how much. The vote's going to be at 7 p.m. London time, 2 p.m. Washington time. And the question really is how much she does lose by, and then what the implications of that. If it's 20 to 30, which is an MP estimated to me on Friday, although that seems generous, she could try to go back to the EU and get more concessions, but that doesn't seem very likely since Brussels has been saying for weeks, no more negotiations. If it's a larger number, you know, Brexit process could go in any number of directions. The UK could try to delay it. They could walk away from the EU, which she was just talking about there, and pay the economic price. Or the big thing would be, you know, do you take Brexit back to the people for a second referendum?
And just say, oh, gosh, never mind.
Well, not even never mind, Steve, but more like, hey, you want to think this one through again?
Is that really possible?
It is possible. And if you asked me 6 weeks ago, I would have probably said, nah, it's not going to happen. But this has been such a mess. And I think also it's gone so badly in terms of the political process that more and more members of Parliament who, remember, were always kind of for remaining in the EU to begin with, are talking about this. But tonight, depending on what happens, I mean, the country could head in any number of directions.
Now, that is an interesting point, Frank Langfitt. We have a bunch of lawmakers who are going to vote down a Brexit deal, at least according to the prognosticators. And a lot of them, you're pointing out, if you ask them privately, they don't favor Brexit at all.
No, they didn't. You had a split in the country in 2016. It was 52-48 in the populace, the people who voted to leave. But it was very well known that members of Parliament did not want to leave the European Union. And the reason for that is there have been a lot of economic benefits, of course. And also, it would take this island nation out of a gigantic trading bloc, which is an enormous economy that gives them a lot of leverage economically in terms of cutting trade deals.
Has the polling support for Brexit been sustained even amid all of this revelation of how difficult it is? Is there still about half the country, give or take, that's for this?
It's a great question, Steve. And I think people would say there's been a split now that it's gone 52 to remain, 48 to leave. But people are so concerned about another vote and that it would be anti-democratic that even Remainers might vote to leave because they would agree with the Prime Minister that it's just not not fair, and you don't get do-overs in democracy.
Wow. Frank, thanks for the update. Really appreciate it.
Happy to do it.
That's NPR's Frank Langfitt.